Hello, and welcome to another episode of It's a History podcast. I am your host, Madison, and this week we are going to look at the history of weddings. I am getting married next week, so I've had the topic of weddings top of mind for some time now. And in the process of wedding planning, I started to wonder just when did weddings or even marriage become what they are today? And I hope to answer that question over the course of today's episode. Throughout history, there have been many similarities within different cultures into how marriage, or what we would call marriage, would have looked like. There are also cultural differences that separate our marriage traditions from region to region. For the purposes of today's episode, we are going to be looking at the broad picture. To prep for this episode, I read Marriage, A History, How Love Conquered Marriage, and the author Stephanie Coontz goes into great detail describing marriage traditions from all over the world and throughout all of history. Their similarities, their differences, aspects that may only pertain to one region, or even one group of people in a region. I definitely recommend giving this book a read if you want to know even more about the history of marriage from a more global perspective. So with that, let's get into the episode. Weddings, even though they go back for some time, are a relatively modern conception. Marriages have been around for much longer than weddings, but for most of history, marriage was more along the lines of a legal contract instead of a ceremony to commemorate one's love. So, for most of history, when one would be married, they would be signing a legal contract or perhaps some other form of formal agreement to their partnership. These marriage contracts were also not really spiritual or romantic. The joining of two people in a marriage primarily played the role of transferring property, protecting familial bloodlines, and controlling women. When a marriage contract would occur, the initial wealth transfer from the bride's dowry would have traditionally been the largest influx of wealth a man would receive in his life. And this was true up and down the class line. For those in lower class rural areas, the skill set of the person you would be married to also mattered quite a bit. Most homes operated under the umbrella of the same career. You wanted to make sure that the person you married would be able to work with you on whatever your chosen path was. And traditional gender roles played a large part in this marriage dynamic. Men would maintain their control over women, and women would care for the home and partake in much of the child rearing. Love was just not something that traditionally mattered in marriage for most of human history. Yes, there were the ones who did happen to be in love, or the ones that would eventually fall in love with their spouse, but a good match financially was much more important than that of love. Marriage wasn't just the merging of two people, it was the merging of two families. And as you went up the social ladder and immense wealth and political intrigue started to enter the conversation, love was pushed to the side even more. For most of history, there was not a lot of choice to be had when it came to one's personal life, especially when it came to marriage. There was no choice in who to marry and no choice in if you would have children. And this was a worldwide phenomenon. Marriage for love was just not something that happened regularly up until about 200 years ago. It was simply inconceivable that two people would base their entire marriage on something as delicate as love, especially when marriage dictated so much of one's financial future. Throughout history, the idea of love being something that was a part of marriage varied from time to time and place to place. There were some cultures that believed true love was actually incompatible with marriage. Philosophers such as Plato thought that love was a wonderful emotion that led men to behave honorably, but that love was not in reference to a love a man would feel for a woman, but it was in reference to a man's love for his fellow men. Even when societies did support young couples falling in love, they did not have a lot of leeway. It was still more important to consider the community than one own's personal feelings when it came to marriage. In the Middle Ages, the French even described being in love as the derangement of the mind. In China, a man's excessive love for his wife would be seen as a threat to the extended family, and public displays of affection were commonly frowned upon throughout history. And I mean, even today, we don't openly encourage excessive PDA, but we don't really bat an eye at public hand-holding, a hug, or a simple kiss. And that's not to say that love wasn't important. It was supported by multiple cultures that the people would fall in love after marriage. But again, the whole marriage should and could not be based on love. Even up to the Victorian era debutante balls, these were events where young girls would be presented to society, signaling that they would be ready for marriage. Every once in a while, you might have had a pair that were actually in love, but many times, especially in the upper class, marriages were made to benefit both families, especially when it came to wealth or property. Summer Brennan states that a key theme to weddings is the symbolic passage from childhood to adulthood. And it has really been in the last 200 years or so that our modern notion of marriage has become what we think of today. In the Western world, it was only in the 19th century that the notion of a husband as the main provider and the wife as a nurturing homebody came into the collective conscious. And really, this notion of a single family income was really only fulfilled in some areas of Europe and North America post-World War II. This was not the norm for most of human history. It was also around the time when marriage for love started to become the norm over marriage as a transaction that divorce started to be something that people wanted the right to do. But that's a topic for another time. If anything, throughout history, death is what often ended marriages, whether it be women dying in childbirth or one of the spouses coming down with a deathly disease. Death was a far more common way that people would end up not married to their spouse. It was also not uncommon for one spouse to pass rather young, which would lead to multiple marriage, with each marriage working to fulfill a need for the widow, whether it be monetary or property or even the need for someone to help raise children. Marriage beyond the first would still be for practical reasons rather than love. But getting back to love, it isn't until we get to contemporary time in Western countries that love becomes the backbone for marriage. Stephanie Kuntz writes that first, they must love each other deeply and choose each other unswayed by outside pressure. From then on, each must make the partner the top priority in life, putting that relationship above any and all competing ties. Even describing what a marriage and a singular definition to encapsulate all marriages throughout time and cultures is quite difficult. In 1949, anthropologist George Peter Murdoch tried to define marriage as a universal institution that involves a man and a woman living together, engaging in sexual activity, and cooperating economically. Almost immediately, this definition can be taken apart. For starters, marriage is not just an act between man and woman, and it hasn't been, even in Mr. Murdoch's time. In certain West African societies, women may be married to other women as, quote, female husbands. If a wife is to bring children into this marriage, or if she were to bear children from an outside affair, these children would be considered descendants of the female husband. Even in areas where marriage was between man and woman, it could often have been between one man but multiple women. There are even instances, well more rare, of one woman being married to multiple husbands. To make a long story short, the view that marriage is just between one man and one woman does not have the historical backing that some may think that it has. Of course, there are many societies where this type of pairing is considered the norm, but it is not representative of all marriages throughout time. In later attempts to define marriage, one anthropologist, Edmund Leach, tried to simplify it by stating that marriage was not about a personal relationship or child rearing, but instead about the transfer of property. And while yes, this is true for a number of marriage traditions, it does not take into account the various ways that property and land is passed down from parent and child. It does not take into account the various ways that property and land is passed down from parent to child. In patrilineal societies, where the family line comes from the father, that land is usually passed from father to son, with questions about illegitimate children being handled differently depending on what region you lived in. In matrilineal societies, such as the Navajo, the path of inheritance is through the mother's bloodline and does not depend on who the father is. If there is one singular common thread throughout the various marriage practices and traditions, it is that a marriage typically results in a sort of pooling of resources, expanding the family, and allowing for more kinship within a community. A marriage would be a mutually beneficial relationship, not just for two people, but for two families, and that would extend beyond the familial bonds and into the surrounding community. Now, on an individual level, especially when it comes to women, women often did not have any say when it came to who they would marry, with some cases of young girls being forcibly taken or traded for another young girl from a surrounding community. Even going back to ancient Babylon, there would be marriage markets where the marriageable young girls would be all brought out in front of a crowd of men, and the men would then bid on the girls, with the girls who were considered the most beautiful going to the wealthiest of men, and the girls who were not considered beautiful being given away to commoners with monetary compensation for their upkeep. Even when you look at times like the Tudor era of England, daughters would often be married off to princes of neighboring countries, the whole marriage having been prearranged by the parents. These matches were more for political strategy than anything else. When it comes to what we think of as marriage, especially for those of us living in, say, the US or Europe, what we consider marriage, especially marriages under the Catholic and Christian umbrella, can be traced back to the 14th century in England when churches started to get real particular over allowing divorces. There was more pressure to make sure your first marriage was the only marriage, as divorce was not an option, and they were really starting to crack down on getting annulments. This meant that all the earlier traditions of inheritance, property transfer, and child rearing would be based on this marriage. Any illegitimate children who had had some inheritance rights prior to the 15th century would now receive nothing in the eye of the law. This is also when we can see a marriage resulting in a single household, where there was no extended family in the home, just the married couple. This in turn, especially for those in rural communities, actually resulted in a delaying of marriage, as setting up one's own household instead of settling in on a family compound cost more money. So couples would save up to afford their own household before tying the knot. Though they may have been a singular household, this did not mean that these couples would be disengaged from the community. There was still a rather high expectation for community involvement. When it came to wedding ceremonies, the 15th century is when we start to see the use of flowers, both as decorative and also as a way to mask odors. This was a time when daily bathing was not the norm, so gathering all those people in the same room would result in a, let's say, an unsavory smell. Along with the change in how wedding ceremonies are decorated, we also start to see the increased popularity of a formal announcement being made of the wedding, which would be more prevalent the higher up the economic ladder you were. So just when did we really start marrying for love? In the 18th century, things really started to take a turn towards love matches versus strategic matches. With the rise in wage labor, men no longer had to wait to inherit land from their fathers, and instead could reach some level of financial freedom on their own by working for a wage. There was also a shift in what exactly the roles in the household would be. The husband had transformed from someone who was sort of a supervisor of family labor to the sole provider for the family, while the wife's role was now more of a focus on her emotional and moral contributions to the family instead of her working for money. This is actually the time where the term spinster, once a word that simply described a woman who spun yarn, into a colloquialism for an unmarried woman. Amongst contemporaries of the time, they recognized that marriage for love went against thousands of years of tradition when it came to marriage. This change in the way marriage was viewed also coincided with the rise in calls for women's suffrage and the equal treatment of women within society. On the flip side, this is also when the stereotypical gender roles of men and women started to become more prominent and solidified this gender split for the next 300 years. This transition also came with an increase in unwed mothers. With marriage becoming more of a personal choice, there was less pressure on young men to marry a woman he had impregnated, leaving many rural women unmarried with children. This led to a moral crisis, which, when partnered with the rise of purity culture in the Victorian era, led to a much more strict outlook on young women and their chastity. As the focus became more and more on immediate families, the after-wedding ritual started to change too. I will have an episode dedicated to honeymoons, but as the role of the family became more individualistic, the common practice of bridal tours where the couple would visit friends and family soon transitioned into private honeymoons spent alone with just the couple. This is also when the wedding itself began to change from a small family affair to something more extravagant. Much of this can be thanked to Queen Victoria, who walked down the aisle to music and had many people in attendance to her wedding. The more public wedding led to the more private honeymoon, as there was no need to travel and visit family that had just attended your wedding. During this time, wedding decorations started to become much more ornate, and the ceremonies were almost always held in a church, especially when looking at marriages in Europe. This is also when putting flowers down the aisle became more popular. Weddings in the US didn't really move beyond a transactional event or a small family affair until the 1920s and the 1930s. There are some exceptions to the rule, especially if some of those exceptions had access to money. And it wouldn't be until the middle of the 20th century that the beginnings of the wedding industry that we know today came into existence, and it has just grown ever since. Having had my own experience interacting with the wedding industry, it is a complicated network of various vendors that all function under the rather strict timelines we have come to have when it comes to the wedding day. Yes, individual weddings can have their own unique aspects to them, but for the most part, they function under the same umbrella. And that's where I'm going to end today's episode. Thank you for listening to today's episode, and I hope you learned something new about weddings and marriage. Stay tuned for the next few weeks as we dive into some of the more niche wedding activities. Sources for today's episode include a JSTOR article titled The Natural History of the Wedding Dress by Summer Brennan, Marriage, a History, How Love Conquered Marriage by Stephanie Kuntz, and a history and analysis of weddings and wedding planning by Claire Finnell. Thank you again for listening to today's episode. If you liked what you heard, please head over to Spotify or Apple Podcasts and leave a review. If you have any questions, comments, or topic ideas, you can email me at itsahistorypodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening, and I hope to have you in the next one.